This video is about replacing the wheel bearing in a Rad Runner 1. I'm gonna try and film the problem here. Got a very loose bearing opposite the chain side. So the chain's on the opposite side. The bearing we're gonna replace is on this side, and it's a little bit more complicated of a bearing to replace. This is the serial number of the motor that this instruction is going to go for. And step one is going to be to remove the wheel. I'm removing the axle nut, the screw, and disconnecting the connector. If you have this problem and are looking for these parts, I'll have a link below where I sell them. After you've removed your wheel, use the Torx bit, take off your rotor, and then use the Phillips bit and take out these screws that hold on the cover to the motor. Now I'm going to gently use this flat screwdriver with a hammer to tap against these lugs and separate the case. Now that the case is separated, this whole assembly should come out. Definitely want to be careful tapping on these because they're very small, and if you break one off, that's going to be tough. You might find some corrosion is holding this case kind of tightly together, and you may find that some heat with a heat gun can help remove the two. Here we can see the bearing that is loose and the rubber seal that failed and let water get in. So next up is to warm this housing up with a heat gun. To get it to expand and let that bearing out. Put your nut on so you're not tapping against that axle nut. Then hold this still, the housing still, while you hammer on here to get it to release the bearing housing. Okay, position a 3-jawed puller carefully so as not to bust the board, and we're gonna give it a yank. Seems pretty well seized on, so I'm gonna add some heat and see if that can get it moving. So I was about to cover this with tape and cut the bearing with an angle grinder to help release it, but then I tried my really big torque wrench that I use on car suspension on the bearing puller, and I was able to pull the bearing. So now I can just remove the bearing, pull it up over the wire, and inspect that shaft. Because there's a little rust on the shaft, I'm gonna use some emery cloth to clean it up. Voila, clean. So you might wanna grease or paint or anti-seize this surface so the new bearing doesn't get so corroded to there in the future. Now we're gonna knock out this seal by just finding the right sized socket and popping it out from there. Compress the new seal in. Sometimes I like to use the old seal to tap the new seal in. I was able to grease this up a little bit and push it in by hand. And we'll do a similar method for the new bearing. Obviously get it very square in there, and then maybe you can use the old bearing or appropriate sized socket to tap this bearing in. Tap, tap, tap. A little heat will definitely help that bearing slide in. Once this whole part is a little bit too hot to handle, that should be enough. That new bearing tapped in nicely with a little bit of heat on here. Woo. And a little thin film of grease. So now we can reassemble. So that just barely but tightly fit over the wire. And because I cleaned up that axle shaft, this slid down into place much easier. And as you'll notice, we don't have that same side-to-side play that we were having before. So now, just need to set it back in there. As you're putting this back together, you can give it a little wiggle to make sure those gears are meshing. And then definitely want to make sure that you align all of the screw holes nicely. I might even recommend that you start putting some screws in to make sure that everything's in alignment before carefully tapping the cases back together. Another tip I'll mention is if you busted up any of these lugs a bunch and left a big burr that's going to keep the cases from seating, use a little file to make sure that this mating surface is nice and flat. If you want to try this yourself, I'm going to offer this bearing and seal for sale on my eBay store. It comes with the one bearing and the one seal. Thanks for watching. Hope it was helpful.